I'm just trying to. Okay. Yeah, I'm just trying to get an understanding again of you know, the so there's this talk, obviously. Maybe you wanted to do that before you hit record, but there's this talk of what happens.
All right, James, thank you so much for joining us today to let us know about the work you've been doing for how many years is it? Where ReGen Villages? When did you
Oh
start?
gosh, yeah, we started ReGen Villages as a Stanford spin-off company, Impact um, investment vehicle in 2016. But the research started at Stanford in probably early 2013. And my case study research started, I'd say, somewhere in the mid to late 90s on organic biodynamic, eco-village, intentional community, co-housing, collaborative, etc. Blue zone areas, put it that way.
Right, nice. So you've been at it for a while.
Yes.
Could you give us just an overview of what ReGen Villages is as an introduction?
Sure. So ReGen Villages is a modern eco-village interpretation that would use technology, machine learning specifically, to design and then operate bioregenerative and resilient neighborhood infrastructure. And the idea really is to use machine learning to first design these communities in an iterative, generative way, thereby hopefully accelerating the process of planning and zoning conditions. And then the other side is that the software, once the neighborhood is constructed, the software is there to run the regenerative infrastructure of that neighborhood: food, water, energy, circular waste to resource management, connectivity to passive home typologies, further external services of mobility on demand, and curriculum, healthcare, et cetera. In addition to that, a ledger for sort of economic value and values across the community.
That is really cool.
Thanks.
Could you say more how you? I know there's probably some proprietary knowledge there, but I'm curious about how the interface of the machine learning and how. Like, I don't know if that's too technical to be asking, but
no, I think that the main thing really is to get the inspiration, if that's okay, because really our focus has been and continues to be the biomimicry. So Mother Earth has been really amazing for 4+5 whatever billion years. Understanding symbiotic natural flows. Mm-hmm. And one of those systems in particular is the mycorrhizal bundle and mycelial networks. And so if you sort of crack into that, look at what happens underneath the forest floor, for instance, you begin to understand this whole fabric, if you will, sort of this Ethernet network of these mycorrhizal fungal bundles that are conveying all kinds of nutrients, minerals, carbon, sugar, nitrogen, and even water allotments, great distances. There's an electrochemical signaling that happens. I have this, who needs this? I have this, who needs this? And it's quite an elegant and lovely metaphor, we think, to economies, and we hope the future of human economies, related especially to long-term positive outcomes, right, which is very different than our current economic milieu, right? So, so that's the sort of the kernel of the Village OS software, is to look at both the design and the operation of these communities through the lens of symbiosis, through the lens of regenerative resilient infrastructure, and that moreover, excuse me, that previously, or currently, you have neighborhoods and buildings and retrofits and however you want to look at it, that are comprised of these silo systems, right? You have energy, you have water, you have waste, you have other kinds of infrastructure, whether it's housing, roads, lighting, electrical, et cetera. But then you also have food, which is always an afterthought, and waste, which is considered to be something that you sort of pump out and get rid of. And the same thing with excess water, that it's considered just sort of a nuisance and it's runoff, and you just sort of need to get rid of it. So we look at these rather through this opportunity zone of creating overlays where one system can know about each other, and then learn from each other, and thereby, excuse me, creating a repository of data that these systems can interact with each other, right? So for instance, a water pump is not just out there in the field or under a house doing what it's doing. It requires electricity. And that electricity, for the most part, doesn't really know what it's sending the power out to do. It's just sending power out to do something. Well, wouldn't it be great that the water pump and the electricity systems know about each other and why and how, and learn? And also then you can begin to create historical data that goes with the real-time sensor data. And then those things together in the aggregate can produce predictive models. And so then you start to get to some really exciting places where, akin to Tesla, we're known as the Tesla of eco villages. It's kind of our tagline. Akin to that you can imagine waking up in the morning, and while you're having your morning coffee, your neighborhood has overnight had a software upgrade. It's learning and it's improving for the sole benefit of you and your family and your community's flourishing, and for planetary flourishing.
Nice. Sorry.
It's okay.
That is actually, that I had goosebumps. I imagine that same information sharing is also happening between communities.
Yeah, the main objective, again, back to the Tesla model, right, is that you have these neighborhoods that have highly anonymized and encrypted infrastructure data that is intended for the village itself, of course, to learn and improve, but that across climate zones, we could be sharing through a thin pipe to the cloud relevant climate-related data as it relates to infrastructure. And that's where we see that the Tesla model really fits very nicely, because it's this idea that your car is a computer rolling down the street, right? And it's learning about road conditions, and you're driving and other drivers, it has all of this awareness. So that when somebody from another part of the world switches on an autopilot, they've actually gained from this bigger brain, this understanding, this knowledge. So it just takes you, each step further to that kind of level 5 autonomous vehicle. Now we're looking at sort of this level 5 autonomous neighborhood and community. But we're really focused on nature and permaculture and what's not built, right? In terms of amenities and values, as opposed to just the passive home built and infrastructure part. And that's something that's really anathema to a traditional real estate developer or landowner, or government, whatever it is. They just, they have a particular appetite or understanding for one thing, which is how much housing can you put on a per square meter plot, and how much profit can you extract from that by doing the least amount in terms of build, cost, and services. So we take a different approach completely.
Yeah, it's gratifying to hear. It's the naysayers be like, oh, just greenwashing something, but obviously, you're far beyond that, and actually doing the work of regenerating.
I like to say often that when it comes to real estate development, that I am a sheep in wolf's clothing, because
Nice.
I really feel that we are at a crossroads in humanity. There's a billion two maybe unit housing shortage globally, with another 2 billion people coming to planet Earth within the next 20, 30 years, give or take, maybe some reductions because of COVID and people's lack of intimacy or whatever. Um, but still, you have a huge um, disaster on our hands if the intent is to try to put all these people into these coastal megacities. And so we have this opportunity. Really, this is not a pitch. This is an urgent call to action. We only have about, I would say, a decade or less to get these lily pads of
Yep.
self-sustaining neighborhoods up and running as a as a moniker for how the next decades to come will be to work, and to get these things moving forward really rapidly. So this is what I've devoted my life to. This is the mission that we're on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
Two questions that come up with that. One is more of because of the ongoing AI debate. What do you say to people like, we're going to have a computer overlord taking, running our town?
Sure. Yeah. Really good question. I've seen all the movies too, just so you know, several times probably with all the flights that I've taken. So I completely get it. There's, again, to take the approach, you look at the Oxford study. There were several, but there were one in particular that I referred to. I believe it was 2010, which basically said that, but their prediction was that 47% of all employment won't exist anymore. Just won't exist anymore due to machine learning and robotics and artificial intelligence. And it's not like the car that replaced the horse whip and the buggy, that all those people were able to then start going and working to build cars. We're talking about a whole new era where, whether it's doctors, lawyers, professors, people are in all kinds of walks of life are going to be pretty much replaced by algorithms, and that's something that we see happening we've already seen it happen, and it's going to happen more and more. It's just a fact, right? And so our thought process is, let's sort of beat them to the game in a way by creating algorithms and machine learning and digital twin software that focuses on human flourishing within planetary boundaries. And so that instead of looking at robots, first taking their jobs and then killing us,
Right.
we can think about robots actually going out into the fields and using friggin' lasers, as we've heard about in other movies before, to do precision weed killing, but understanding that ground cover is really critical. Soil health is number one. That organic biodynamic farming principles can be imparted, and this regenerative ag and biodiverse ag is something that can be really in this magical dance with robots.
Right.
And that gets to be really fun and interesting to imagine. There was a solar punk video that came out a few months ago that I thought was really interesting. It was basically just kind of like this traditional farm but it had these different drones and robots kind of sort of helping out in between, the human overlords, but the robots were there to help kind of like move cattle around. The robots were there to kind of do some of the weeding and other things. It was really interesting, and I think that's the perspective I want to have in terms of machine learning. That it's supposed to actually free us up.
Right.
Right. You look at the other side of this logic. Okay. Why do you go to work? What is the point of work?
Right.
Okay. The point of work is, okay, you leave the box that you pay rent or mortgage on to get into a four-wheel box, to drive to another box, to afford, probably 35% of that income to pay for the empty box you left for 8 hours. Okay. Then the other part of that work is to go to feeding yourself and hydrating yourself, and having access to communications and other kinds of things. And then, so the point is that if you're living in a neighborhood where some good portion of your Maslow hierarchical needs are being met, the delta for universal basic income or some other income that you can generate is really reduced, right? Yeah. So we especially look at this for the global South, where, gosh, it's, you can start to imagine that you make these really beautiful peri-urban and rural areas that become really attractive, and people start to move and live there. And there's a path to ownership, and their effort and commitment to that community enables them to have entitlement on their property. But moreover, we can start to shift the model of work into self-worth. Yes. People are doing things that matter to themselves, to the planet. Like I like to say often, when you have a full belly, and you're surrounded by abundance, your tendency to be generous and compassionate and think big thoughts becomes a lot easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to say sounds, before you mentioned solar punk, I was going to say this all sounds very solar punk, but in reality. So I was very excited that you actually do know about that. Of course you do. This also reminds me a little bit of something William Irwin Thompson used to write about in the 1970s. He had this concept of the meta-industrial village, which is going into this concept of planetization or planetary culture. We don't get rid of technology. We miniaturize it somehow and make it work in relationship with the non-human world, right? So very much it seems like this is one of your principles.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a neighborhood guy. I grew up in New York, and I really always understood from a young age, the power of neighborhoods, but also I could see, I was always amazed in New York City how anything ever worked, because it was layers of this brittle infrastructure, on top of itself, from 150 years ago, whatever, with very large rodents running around and chewing on things. And you're, as a kid, you just look around and you're like, it's not going to last long. Whatever that wire is connected to, so. And then Hurricane Sandy really kind of proved that out, right? When my family was without power for like 6 weeks, and the shelves were going bare because people were hoarding and grabbing whatever they could. And then COVID, of course, really kicked that up a notch, isn't it? So we've seen now this exodus from cities because people don't trust the urban infrastructure and being close to each other, and they want, to think that their ecosystem can be there for them. There's a real reawakening about that now. Of course, we predicted that, 8+ years ago. And to be honest, there were a lot of people who laughed at us, or chuckled at least under their breath, that we were talking about changing this mega trend to cities, that anybody would ever be interested to live outside of cities. And we said, yeah, well, there's already a group of people who are interested in this, pretty big population actually. But I said, it doesn't take much a trend by its very nature is a shiny object in the distance. That's pretty much what a trend is. So when you create these turnkey communities, people, urbanites, feel like, oh gosh, I could actually live there. And I don't have to worry about being a farmer. I don't have to worry about struggling, being out there. And I'm with a bunch of other like-minded people, for instance. Then, that trend is easily created. So that's kind of where we're at right now. And we see that as being something that's increasing because of COVID.
So in terms of trend, have you broken ground anywhere yet? And where, how many places are you starting to get progress?
Well,
how many governments are actually talking to you?
So, the thing is, since 2016, when we first announced at the Venice Biennale for Architecture, in 2016, we've had outreach from almost, I think, every part of planet Earth, save for Antarctica. Okay, and maybe the North Pole, but sort of everywhere in between, you can imagine. I got off a call this morning with a group from Mongolia, for instance. So from I like to say from Moscow to Mumbai, from Malaysia to Texas. I mean, it's been all over, the world. We have, we're a Dutch holding company. We have an office in Sweden, in London, here in the U.S., in Canada, British Columbia, and now opened up a new one in Santiago in Chile. So we're a very strange multinational startup. There's no doubt about that. We have probably, I'd say, 25 to 30 likely projects on our sort of spreadsheet right now, with 4 or 5 of them as the most likely ones that can sort of take hold, we think, within the next 3 to 5 years, concurrently. So that's right now. It's in Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, UK, Canada, and I think those were the places right now. Some other places could come faster. It just really depends on, again, the local regional government, land opportunity, and the willingness to move faster.
Right. Sounds like a plan.
We got really close. We got really close in 2018 to breaking ground and to realizing our first community. We were trying to do 300 homes in this neighborhood about half an hour due east of Amsterdam, and but the local government changed in 2018, right as we were in the middle of this heated negotiation and discussion about allowing us to do 300 homes. They only allowed us to do 203, but the problem was that was not enough to show economic feasibility, and so we weren't able to get the funding we needed at that moment to move everything forward. So if I was Elon and I had the private equity to just do a loss leader or a break-even project, I would have just done the 203 homes. Right. But we were trying to do 300, primarily not only because to get the 12 to 15% IRR, but also that we could take 1/3 or so of the housing inventory and make social affordable access. So we're telling the story that regenerative resiliency is not just for gated communities for the wealthy. So that's where that particular project unfortunately stopped. We're continuing to engage with different Dutch municipalities and seeing what's possible and where we can go. And we know we're going to get there. Yep. That's not the question. We know we're going to do it, right? It's which government is ambitious enough, with the right land opportunities, and then the magic, of course, is we already know where the big funding can come from. We already know where that big finance that's going to come in and underwrite the whole development. So that's really where, we're, our focus has been from the very beginning, even kind of before we were doing the software development, but after our mechanical engineering development, we were really focused on the business side. How can we transact with sovereign wealth and pension funds who are transiting fossil fuel investments? Okay, that was our logic. How can we get to a place where we can transact with these folks? And we were just, everything we've been doing these years is slowly but surely leveling up to get to this place where we could speak their language, have the right, banking advisory to craft the spreadsheets that speak their language. And now we're really positioned very nicely. So with a little bit of additional private equity investment in us, we'll be able to, we think, start to really cascade and replicate and scale our communities.
And do you sense that you having leveled up and learned the language, do you sense you're having an effect on those institutions, that they're starting to look at how they use their money differently?
Well, look, there's a very interesting thing that happened in the EU about a month ago, which is that the EU Commission basically has told all fund managers by law, you can no longer call your fund green or eco or planet friendly or SDG related if it doesn't check off these very specific 18 boxes related to the circularity and the passive energy, productiveness of these communities and resilience measures. So that's put these fund managers into quite a twist right now, isn't it? Because there's not only is there no deal flow pipeline that fits this model, except for us, but they have to be able to really check off all those boxes. So we've been running, we just finished a wonderful research initiative with Duke University for what living in ReGen Villages could look like 50 years later, right? In terms of reduced burdens on healthcare systems, on government, on creating new economic models, on brokering peaceful, happy places, healthy places, et cetera. And that, that's really huge, because then that then poured into this UN climate prize that we've applied for, which has to do with answering pretty much all the 17 SDGs under one umbrella. Mm-hmm. So this is who we are. This is exactly who we are. So the point is, the world is now, precipitously moving to this kind of deal flow. And we're in a sweet spot because we're the only ones, really, to be quite honest, that offer all of that under one umbrella.
Nice. Well done, sir.
Well, it's I'd love to say that we're there, we're doing it, it's happening. I'd love to say that everything is rosy and there's no issues or complexities, but the truth is we're base camp of Everest.
And Everest is out to get you.
Well, and Everest is, 1 in 8 don't come back, my friend. 1 in 8 don't come back. It's not a sport that I would ever choose to do, put it that way. And I've never aspired to be a real estate developer. I don't know who in their life aspires to become a real estate developer, but it's something that you really need fortitude in dealing with the costs and the ecosystems that are in place to delay you and to cause, and then there's corruption and graft and all those things. And those are all the good points, by the way. Anyway, just kidding.
I'm curious if part of what's coming up for me is these building these new communities. Do you have any plans, or is it on your radar to be retrofitting communities, or to kind of going into rural communities and being like, hey, would you like to play with?
It's probably the number one question we get. I would say probably number one. What about retrofits? Well, first of all, when I look at an urban environment, urban context, the way we look at retrofits is through the context of overlays, right? You're not going to take a pre-war building from Manhattan, Lower West Side, whatever it is, and make it self-sustaining, regenerative and resilient, without taking that building probably down to its studs, and reworking multiple millions worth of components. And even then, you're not going to get the ability to really generate enough nutrition to feed that building, or the capacity to digest the waste, because you really need some open space to do those things. Okay. But you can do these overlays, and the overlays, I mean, you can do rooftop ag, or atrium, or alleyway, or balcony ag. And then in the aggregate, you are actually generating some really meaningful supplement to people's diets that's bioavailable and I mean, building sourced. Okay. So there's that. That could include some light animal protein, chicken, eggs. Depending upon if there's a little bit of open space nearby, you could do some other kinds of small animals, whether it's sheep or goat, or not talking about lots of them, but a few for some dairy and other things, rabbit, whatever, turkey. The vegans are yelling at me now. Of course, I hear it, but we're talking about when things go badly with infrastructure, do you have the ability to feed yourself, right? There was a wonderful study that came out of the University of Catalan, which really looked at how can you feed pretty much a city block of about 20,000 people in case there's a breakdown. How can you actually feed that block? And when they did the planning, when they did all of the mapping in all of the lined streets, all of the buildings in that city block, every possible surface area had glazed or grow area environment, or fruit or nut or berry bearing trees and bushes and legumes, etc. And the answer they came up with was, yes, you can actually do this, as long as there's a social contract for vegetarian veganism for that. So the main point is that you can actually create infrastructure that can save people's lives in case there's a big network disruption. They may not have the T-bone steak they want to eat, or the full 3-egg omelet, or whatever it may be, but they'll have what they need to get by. Then looking at the outside of cities, we get this question also about like the old Italian village, or the old Spanish village, or Portuguese village, or whatever it is. Wherever you look around the world, the peri-urban and the rural areas have been abandoned and neglected. So it's really true that that these areas are in dire need of to be rejuvenated. However, our model in that case is new build next to the old build. So the new build brings all those urbanites, turnkey neighborhoods, passive homes, circularity, regenerative permaculture, 2 thumbs up, everything's working great. And then you take your time to restore historically the cultural significance of that ancient village from the 12 or 1300s, whatever it is. Those become more community spaces or visitor spaces. Mm-hmm. And that creates this really nice symbiosis between the new and the old. So that's been our thought process. Because again, imagine going to an Italian village or Spanish village, from the 1300s. The moment you start to look at trying to replumb a single house, a wall falls down. On the other side, the roof collapses. I mean, in other words, it's so brittle that you really need to be very careful about what you do there.
So that kind of brings up for me do you have, I don't know, as part of the OS or part of your structure, I guess social technologies for like conflict resolution and community building, and have you been working on that area as well?
Yeah, the truth is, and maybe some of your readers will find this to be abhorrent, but we have been really kind of governance agnostic. Mm-hmm. And what I mean to say by that is we've seen through our research all of the failures of intentional communities and eco-villages and co-housing and collaboratives around the one person or one family vote, right? Where everyone's involved and everybody thinks there's this great democracy. But the truth is there's always that guy or that gal. I think now they're called Karen and Ken. I don't know. And basically, no offense to any Karen or Kens, you know, out there in the world, but basically there's people who have had something happen in their childhood, they've had something happen in their lives, a divorce, whatever it is. They're bitter. They've got they're curmudgeon, you know, they're skeptical, they're cynical, even though they've decided to move into this neighborhood and buy in or rent into this neighborhood. They feel like the only time they've ever going to be heard is by dragging those community meetings out and being adversarial. So our thought process is, wait a second, let's approach this from a management operating company perspective, where the HOA fee ledger balancing system seems to take a lot of people's chip off their shoulders or guilt, because that's all brokered by the Village OS, right? What you contribute, what you don't contribute. If you don't contribute, you pay a higher monthly association fee. If you do contribute, it's lower. That's fine. It's very understandable. We celebrate organic events, whether it's DIY movement, maker movement, cooking, baking, cultural events. We think all of those things can happen naturally. And those people, again, who want to participate can participate. Those who don't have to. And so there's nothing dogmatic, in other words, about living in the ReGen Villages. We've really tried to do is model this over around current residential development in developed economies. That people understand, okay, I buy a house, I rent a house, or I have social affordable access to a house, and I have my commitments each month to make to the community financially or through other things. And there is no voting per se. Like, you're not managing the community. Our OPCO is. They can have a board, an advisory board, like most, you know, homeowners associations do. But at the end of the day, humans seem to really respond very well to defined rules that they move into, as opposed to rule books that they can kind of create themselves. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. And and it sounds like in that, though, there's also enhanced communication capability, like the OS does allow people to see and know what they're contributing. And I don't know, is there also, you know, like community chat thing, or you're just like not even?
Yeah, you know, the thing is so here's the thing from our perspective. You know, myself and our CTO is based in Amsterdam. You know, we come from a long background of software development. And that's where I cut my teeth. Okay, I started as a game designer and a video game developer, and doing software for special effects for motion pictures. You know, that's how I moved from New York to Northern California in the first place. But it's, you know, the best technology is technology you don't see. Right. When you get into a Prius, when you get into a Tesla, you don't have to all of a sudden have a pocket protector and, you know, a slide rule to turn the car on and to drive down the street. Okay, we feel the same way about living in a neighborhood. It's really the best ideas and concepts are your house is cozy and warm and beautiful, or it's cool and refreshing, whatever the season might be. That these baskets of delicious food are brought to your doorstep. There are these piazza kitchens where you're smelling the recipes of families, and you're invited and you're part of this larger, you know, community scene. That there's this visceral, you know, connection to the natural world and the symbiosis that you're related to. So it's not about dashboards and apps, and, you know, it's that to us is, you know, should really be played down. Of course, there are neighborhood administrators and people who are going to be working the farming and everything else, they can have the tools that they need at their at their disposal. But we just don't think that this sort of synthetic environment is the right way forward.
So you want to foster human interaction and allow us to self-organize into a joyful new reality with a little
Exactly.
bit of...
Look, I don't know about you, but you move into a neighborhood, and I mean, I'm living in a suburb, just a bike path from Stanford University, and I'm surrounded by neighbors, many of whom I don't know.
Yep.
I'll never know because they pull their car into their garage, and the moment the car hasn't even stopped, the brake lights, the car's not even off, and their garage door is coming down. That's it. That's how American homes are designed, right? Mm-hmm. Get into that garage, close the door. Some neighbors I do know who are not very nice.
Yep.
For whatever reason, they are cold and distant. And then there's some that we're actually really close to. And I mean, like best friends, like really connected to. That's natural. That's life.
Right.
There's no such thing as utopia where everybody loves each other and everybody likes each other and everybody gets along. So you're naturally going to gravitate in like a ReGen Villages neighborhood to those folks who just, somehow or another you laugh together, cry together, you make a bond. And those things happen. There's an ebb and flow with that as well. So we can't control for that. There's no human control. There's no software in the world that's ever going to control for that.
Well, that's the best part. I mean, I had a sense of you and what you're doing, but it's very gratifying to the scope and the depth and the fidelity, in terms of the the complexity of human life, of what you've done, and also the integrity of in not building that first one. Because I imagine, like, you didn't have the money, but if that was where you're at, you could have just done it. But instead, it's like, no, the first one is going to be a healthy lily pad. It's just, that's the way it's got to be.
Yeah, and it's about the building of the neighborhood that we wanted to do, but also that we want to be a good neighbor. We want to have people around us who are excited and want us there. And there's this whole part about indigenous wisdom.
Yep.
To impart.
Absolutely.
That those natural flows are inherent there.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of those obstacles, et cetera, that we'd have to always kind of look at. And as much as I believe we can just kind of very quickly replicate and scale these things, we do. Each community has to have that cultural significance and impart. So
its own unique essence, as
yeah.
Carol would say. Wow. This has been great. Jeremy, do you have anything that's coming up for you? Any questions?
Well, James, as you're talking, you're hitting the questions. You brought up indigenous wisdom, the shift in our thinking where we become more place-based, right? It seems like these values are kind of built into the long-term project of building these communities to allow us to become culturally much more place-based, indigenous thinking oriented, indigenous complexity oriented, thinking in terms of living systems and permaculture. I mean, these are all cultural values that need to come online right now, just at a planetary scale. So the question is, how do we do it? And it seems like the answer is, well, we talk about this all the time, that kind of oscillation between the global and the hyperlocal. And it seems like you get to the global by really thinking about how you situate yourself in the world, in the local. So just playing with that. But maybe a question would be to anticipate the next few years. How do you see this? If scaling is the wrong word, then maybe how do you see this rolling out in the next few years? I mean, what needs to happen? Best case scenario, realistic scenario, however you want to take that question. What needs to happen in the next decade?
Well, again, we celebrate the peri-urban and the rural areas. They're beautiful, they're natural, they've been abandoned. And with the right planning, with the right conditions, because of autonomous vehicles, drone deliveries, drone taxis, high speed transit, like you mentioned, like either Elon or Virgin, other kinds of Hyperloop, et cetera, that the need to live in a city can be further and further separated. So you can travel to the city in a very comfortable, high-speed way on your own terms, go there for cultural reasons or other kinds of things, and yet know that you have this very secure, very beautiful place in nature out in the countryside. And that's the goal, really, that we can look at this urgent call to action on Earth right now in terms of critical housing shortages, in terms of life support systems within the neighborhood scale that can be breakaway should district scale services fail, and that through that's really indigenous wisdom right there, because then you're living in these places that are having celebrations, when everything fails, because they're humming along, they're doing everything just great. I'm off to say, in Pennsylvania, when the power goes out, for the Amish, it's Tuesday. In other words, doesn't matter to them, right? I recount this story. I was in Taiwan. I did a lecture at Tainan University. I was brought up to the mountains, this rural community up in the mountains, this indigenous community of Taiwan, where they have typhoon, mudslides, earthquakes. I mean, it's like Jobville, you know what I mean, in terms of natural disasters. And they told me a story that there was I think a combination earthquake, typhoon, mudslide, all in one kind of thing. The roads were washed out, the power was taken out, and the government brought these helicopters in with like emergency supplies for these rural areas. And when the helicopters landed, there was a festival happening. There was a big party happening. Why? Because they've stopped relying on that infrastructure a long time ago. Right. They're self-contained with their resiliency. So there's another really important thing I just want to mention, that one of the things that impacted me in my research for ReGen Villages was this Rockefeller Foundation study, I think from 2011, which basically said that up until 1950, 75% of all humanity lived in small self-sustaining communities. There was about 2.5 billion people on Earth at that time. So that 75% lived in these small self-sustaining communities. What was the economy? Barter. You grew more than you needed, and you would bring that to the local piazza square. You would trade, you would barter, there'd be culture, there'd be entertainment, and that's how people lived and flourished for eons before that, okay? When we became agrarian, right, up until 1950. Then the thesis says from 1950 to 2050, the Rockefeller report said that 10 billion people, 75% of which will be living in coastal megacities, completely disassociated from their natural resources, incapable of surviving, should things go wrong, etc. So that's the framework that we focus on. We have been an active member of the EU Smart Rural Village Commission, of the European Network for Rural Development, now the new Bauhaus Roundtable. We were appointed to the UN Climate Secretariat Resilience Lab. And I guess the one thing I'd like to just share with your community and your audience is that, yeah, we're raising private equity. We believe that we have this amazing opportunity to be at the forefront of generative software design that's also moving the needle to create these neighborhoods at scale around the world. And so there's a lot of upside potential to be an investor in ReGen Villages. So just want to throw that out there.
Yeah. Do you have a sense of how much equity you would need to push your kind of the needle over where you're funded and ready to go? Yeah,
it's a 16.5 million euro Series A round that we're in right now. So we're looking for 5.5 million euro lead. and then the other 11 to follow. We have a number of family offices and industrial partners who've essentially committed to follow on in terms of syndicating, the 11 million part, but we have to find that lead investor of 5.5 million. With that 16.5 million euro, we can build the first 400 home community. We can finish out our Village OS software, and we're then sort of with the big folks in terms of a generative software platform that is really compelling for these kinds of stakeholders around the world.
May it be so.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So anybody in your network you might know, that would be great. And just let me know also how else I can support this lovely article and how it's coming out. And then, of course, what you're working on, that would be great.
For sure.
Great.